Salt. This simple crystalline mineral has existed on Earth for billions of years, predating life itself. Occurring naturally in our oceans and underground deposits, salt has played a pivotal role in human civilization. In this documentary, we'll be exploring the history of this life-giving mineral. We'll also be traveling through Africa, Asia, Europe, and America to see how salt is mined and the many different types found in different regions throughout the world. This is the truest example of man's inseparable relationship with nature. It's the story of salt and earth, of salt and life. Besides Rome, there was no other place in Italy as well-traveled as the northeastern city of Venice. Known for its famous canals and being the home of Marco Polo, it's also teeming with a rich cultural history. In the past, Venice was just an intertidal zone composed of a string of reef islands. But salt would change the tides of its history forever. On the farthest edges of the city sits the tiny little island of Torcello. In the 5th and 6th centuries, refugees from successive Germanic and Hun invasions began to settle here, looking for a new life. It was a desolate place. Aside from being surrounded on all 4 sides by the sea, it was rife with swampland and had no arable land for crops. But they did have one abundant resource they could rely on: salt. The settlers set to work, evaporating seawater so they could harvest it into salt. Like the Chinese in the Far East, it all began with a single pond. After perfecting their methods, in later centuries, they began to build more and more ponds to expand their production. Once they had established the industry, the city grew quickly, but so did their appetite for wealth. Soon they began seeking control of the surrounding regions and created their own salt monopoly. It's midsummer in Cervia, one of Italy's coastal cities. This is 65-year-old Oscar Turoni, who's been working here since 18. He and several other employees of the salt plant volunteer to show visitors the salt mining methods that were used in Italy thousands of years ago. After the salt water has been successfully diverted, it's filtered through 3 filter tanks into 5 saline water ponds. Throughout this process, the concentration of salt gradually rises, and the sodium chloride sinks to the bottom of the ponds. Gradually, the sun and wind will evaporate the water, leaving behind salt crystals that are prime for harvesting.
Ancora continuiamo a lavorare il sale, a raccogliere il sale come si faceva centinaia di anni fa. Quindi ecco, noi siamo nati allora, ancora andiamo avanti, siamo cresciuti. Ecco, qui naturalmente il sale viene raccolto tutti i giorni, intercalando i bacini. Ogni giorno si raccolgono 5-6 bacini, alla fine della settimana si è pulita tutta la salina, si è raccolta. Questo è un po' il sistema che veniva fatto appunto centinaia di anni fa.
Cervia is the closest Italian city to Venice and also has rich stores of sea salt. They too practice the old ways of making salt. We meet the curator of the Cervia Salt Museum, who shows us something called the St. Marco Seal.
Questo tipo di sigillo ha un significato importante, perché vuol dire che noi eravamo sotto la dominazione veneziana. Il marchio era una sorta di marchio di qualità che ci diceva che era il sale prodotto nella città di Cervia, ma che era controllato dalla Repubblica di Venezia, quindi era una specie di marchio di qualità di quelli che noi oggi abbiamo, tipo il DOP o il GP, eccetera.
A seal is confirmation that the Republic of Venice's spheres of influence once extended all along the coasts of Italy. In those times, Cervia's salt was under the control of the Pope of Vatican City. But once Venice knew what they had was comparable to gold, they seized Cervia through means of war.
L'intento di Venezia è quello di avere un dominio soprattutto per quello che riguarda il commercio, perché Venezia è una repubblica, la Repubblica Marinara, che ha grandissimo interesse nell'ambito commerciale del Mediterraneo. Commerciava già granaglie, spezie, il sale era estremamente importante, per cui avere il dominio sul sale voleva dire avere un dominio molto forte proprio su tutto il commercio. Essendo una grande potenza commerciale, aveva interesse naturalmente ad ottenere questo predominio sul sale.
Yet Venice did not only control Cervia. To eliminate any competition, it established a powerful navy, holding sway on all the salt-producing cities on the Italian coast. All salt transported to Venice would then be sold to distributors at exorbitant prices with strict preconditions on where they could sell it. Soon, Venice became the largest salt provider in all of Europe. The state's rise to power was swift and sure. Employment numbers skyrocketed, making the city one of the first major economic systems to embrace the concept of capitalism. Italians have long since adopted a more mechanized system of salt production, leaving the old salt ponds to serve as a historical relic of early salt-making techniques. Even now, many old-timers still toil away in the blazing sun to pay tribute to their ancestors and the contributions they made to make Venice the great city it is today.
È un'emozione mettere in fila tutti i granellini di sale per un percorso che ci porta a una crescita identitaria nostra. Oggi come oggi qui si lavora moltissimo sull'identità.
While Venice enjoys most of its wealth from commerce, in the southwest of China, people are making their fortunes through industrialized production. This is Zhuogong in China's Sichuan province. All morning, Yu Sen has been busy working in his tofu pudding restaurant. It's a popular breakfast staple here, and it costs about $1 American. Yusen's secret ingredient for his tofu pudding lies in the seasoning, a special pepper he adds to his dipping sauce. But you can't have the dish without the salt. The soybean milk is going to have some amazing changes. Yusen is confident in his skill in making tofu pudding. The brine in the bottle is the residue of processed salt. As the sodium reacts with the magnesium chloride, the soybean milk begins to thicken. The cheap yet delicious pudding is as appetizing as it is filling and has become the most popular dish with salt workers here. It has all the typical characteristics of a laborer's meal: cheap, quick to make, and full of nutrients. Just as much of a staple in Zhuogong are the old crown blocks that were used in ancient salt production. While only a few remain today, they still have a certain air of regality to them, like an emperor looking proudly down upon his kingdom. "200 years ago, on the banks of the Fuxi River, row upon row of taverns line the streets, while smoke and vapor plumed above its saltworks chimneys. On the nearby flagstone roads, peanut shells crunched under the feet of passers-by, and a forest of crown blocks dotted the skyline. The Shanghai Salt Well was the world's first well over 1 kilometer deep. Back then, the salt produced in this well would fetch as much as 533 taels of silver each day. Put in comparison, the county magistrate at that time only earned 45 taels a year. So in just one day, he could produce as much as the annual salary of over 10 magistrates. Merchants swarmed to Zhuogong, convinced that an untold fortune awaited them in its precious wells. This is the Yunchuan Ancestral Temple, which belonged to the family of Wang Longyun, a major salt merchant of the time. Song Liangxi's grandfather used to manage its operation. Everything he remembers from when he was young has at least some connection to salt.
小时候啊，自贡到处都是天车，天车林立，钱管是纵横啊。盐是这个巨大机器运转的核心，有人倾家荡产，有人一夜暴富。这块土地聚集了中国最爱冒险的人。
In 1833, 22-year-old Wang Longyun received his share of the family property, some money, and their abandoned salt well. Since at that time, salt excavating technology was underdeveloped and the brine was so deep underground, getting it out was a risky venture. It costed time, money, and considerable effort. In fact, these were the very reasons his own family had abandoned the salt well in the first place. But Wang Longyun was willing to make the gamble his parents wouldn't. A born entrepreneur, he disregarded the advice of his family and peers and threw caution to the wind. Unbeknownst to him and his crew, he was just one step away from his fortune. It was dangerous manual labor, taking 4 men balancing on a rickety footboard to drill the earth below. It's said that for every strike, a child would throw a coin into a pot. The sound of money motivated Wang Longyun's men, making them forget the risk they were taking. One misstep could mean serious injury. Locals dubbed it the Golden Steps because they believed that every step they took would make them rich. But after years of work, they had nothing to show for it, and Wang Longyun's money was running out. He had 2 options. Either he could leave empty-handed with his tail between his legs, or look for investors.
自贡最南的盐井开凿了40-50年才能找到卤水，所以说它的风险性很大。还有就是打下去以后，费了上万两、上10万两的白银，没水、没气，也就报销了。但是由于有高额的利润呢，总有成功的人，所以它的吸引力也特别的大。风险和利润并存，如果成功了，你就是富豪。
Just when Wang Longyun was thinking about giving up, 2 businessmen from Shanxi province offered to invest in his well. But their conditions were harsh. If brine was found, profits would be divided into 30 parts, with 12 belonging to Wang and 18 to the 2 merchants. Furthermore, the contract stipulated that only when they had made back their money would the salt well and his equipment be returned to him. That was good and bad news for Wang. On the one hand, he would have a fresh injection of capital, but on the other, he could lose 3/5 of his profit. It was a decision he was reluctant to make. But just before he was about to sign the contract, he heard his name being called from the street. Turning around, he saw one of his workers running towards him, excitedly shouting they had just found brine. It turned out that the well was even more special than they had originally thought. Not only did it produce the sort of dark brine that had high concentrations of salt, but also natural gas. It ended up laying the groundwork for his business empire. But digging deeper into the wells still required more capital, and since he couldn't fund the operation himself, he was forced to enter the proposed partnership with the Shanxi merchants. Finally, the 2 parties reached a deal. Today's Zhuogong Salt-Making Industry History Museum used to be the Xiqing Guild Hall, built by Shanxi and Shanxi salt merchants of the Qing Dynasty. It combines the elegant architecture of the old royal courts of northern China and the more common buildings of the south. Back then, businessmen from Shanxi, Shaanxi, and Zhejiang often gathered here to talk trade. The contracts they arrived at were called well contracts, over thousands of which are still kept in this museum. The most famous one is the Tongsheng Well contract, which is considered the earliest joint stock operation in China.
但是就是在这55平方公里的土地上，历代的员工艰辛的劳作，一共开凿了13000多口盐井。如果以每口盐井300米计算的话，等于靠人力打穿了400多座珠穆朗玛峰。
Even more important than the drilling techniques used in the salt business of Zhejiang was the endless supply of venture capital. Funds were pooled from around the country to facilitate what is now known as the salt rush. All of Zhejiang was inundated with crown blocks and bamboo pipes transporting brine and natural gas. It was one of China's first industrialized cities. Today, the towering oil rigs provide the world's most important energy source. Yet the methods used to acquire oil are much the same as those used to drill salt in Zhejiang. The salt drilling techniques of Zhejiang reached their zenith in the late 18th century. Able to reach more than a kilometer beneath the ground, the techniques developed to extract salt foreshadowed those used today to obtain the fuel that powers the whole world. In Great Britain, the city of Cheshire in northwestern England used to be the center of salt production in the country. Just as in China, many of its old salt working plants are still in operation today. Lion Saltworks is an old salt-making plant privately owned by the Thompson brothers. Built in the 1900s, it brought waves of wealth to the city for over 100 years. Now, it has been converted into a museum. For Mr. Thomas, visiting the museum brings back a lot of memories from his childhood. Back then, it was a struggle just to get hired at the plant.
Yeah, when I was a teenager, this was one of the popular places for unskilled young men to come and work because they could make quite a lot of money.
For the next 100 years, the plant kept to its tried and true methods that they had developed since their inception, using giant iron pans to boil their brine.
It was hard physical work. It was quite dangerous. If you fell into one of the evaporation pans, you were in severe difficulty, and there were no guardrails. The atmosphere was extremely hot, extremely damp, and not many people were able to work on the evaporation pans where the best salaries were. That's why the salaries there were very good.
Once a week, like clockwork, the banging of shovels striking iron could be heard as the pans were being emptied. Thomas tells us on those days, the noise was so loud, he didn't even need to set his alarm. At that time, salt was one of Britain's major exports. Colonizers sold immense amounts of it all across the globe using their powerful fleets, creating an empire that rivaled many of the greatest and most extensive the world has ever seen. During that time, the Thompsons sold hundreds of tons of salt every week and accumulated more money than they ever could have imagined. The two brothers amassed so much wealth that they generously decided to give something back to the men who worked for them, paying for their vacations and even their children's educations. Liz Royals, curator of the Lion Saltworks Museum, still keeps the salary records of all the salt workers who worked in the plant from 1947 to 1948. They are so comprehensive that they include their workdays and hours, as well as their food expenditures and holidays. The records also show that these were the first years in which the factory went into a noticeable decline.
We can also tell from the book how much salt was being produced or how many orders they had in, because you can see here the 23rd of September 1947, these 19 people were working on site to produce salt. But if we go back a month to the 15th of July 1947, these people were making salt on site, and these extra 3 people here had been brought in from the local Sunbeam Works to help them make more salt because they had so many orders on.
Back then, Cheshire had dozens of salt-making plants, equivalent to Lion Saltworks in scale. But there was a price to its prosperity. At the time, so much brine was being pumped from underground that Cheshire became severely polluted, and large sections of land began collapsing all over the city. In the mid-20th century, newer technology allowed for vacuum salt production and took over the traditional methods, yielding higher quality salt at a lower cost with less pollution. This meant that several of the larger plants in Cheshire had to either relocate or restructure. Eventually, Lion Saltworks closed down, and the Thompson children were forced to move out of the city and find a new way of life. In this London seafood market, doors open at 4 in the morning. Almost every kind of seafood can be found here. It's one of Europe's oldest seafood markets, with a history of more than 300 years. Here, customers prefer salted fish. Des McDonald is the head chef at a restaurant called Vintage Salt. Their signature breakfast dish is salted fish.
So here at Vintage Salt, we just showcased 3 of the dishes that we typically might do, trying to bring the old-fashioned kipper back into fashion. So the first one is a traditional cooking method what used at breakfast in the higher classes of England maybe 100 years ago. Slow poached kippers with a little bit of butter, finished with a parsley, caper and lemon butter.
Salted fish has been popular throughout British history. However, in the past, it was a delicacy that only the wealthiest could enjoy. Today, he buys all his salted fish directly from the seafood market and cooks it with his own special ingredients. His dream is to bring the forgotten dish back into fashion. For Chef McDonald, every order of salt fish is like a personal victory. Today, salted fish can be found in many fast food style restaurants in Britain and is no longer only available to the elite. In the 13th century, Marco Polo reached China after a long and arduous journey. In his diaries, he wrote excitedly about the abundance of salt fields he encountered between city and sea. Yongzhou, Jiangsu province, neighbors the sea in the east and the Yangtze River in the south. Like Venice, Yongzhou is also a major producer and trader of salt. Marco Polo would have been the first Westerner to witness China's salt industry in its adolescence. Centuries ago, Yongzhou was one of China's most affluent cities. Walking on the streets of Yongzhou today, there are still traces of its past glory, whether it be in their ancient salt ponds, their buildings, or even their autumn leaves. Most Yongzhou residents' days begin with a simple cup of tea. But in this 100-year-old tea house, there's a bit more on the menu. This is where 80-year-old Mao Zedong was born. After returning home from Shanghai a few years ago, he's gotten back in the habit of drinking tea every morning.
我会是吃烫干丝，这是还有个三丁包，这爱好这些东西。早上呢就是这个皮包水，晚上呢也好洗澡，水包皮，早上也好喝茶。这是我们扬州人的这个老的传统习惯。
For the people here, nothing is better than chatting over a cup of tea in the morning and taking a nice warm bath in the evening. In the past, this would have been considered a luxury only ancient salt merchants could afford. Although today Yongzhou has lost its status as one of the wealthiest cities in China, its salt culture still thrives. But wealth could not be acquired without the right political connections. In order to operate privately without government interference, one had to obtain what was called a salt certificate. Zhou Zhiyang has been accumulating his collection of salt-related mementos for the past 12 years.
这个在当时来说，应该算120斤的话，应该算一个 比较大的，一次野营的税收，估计每个庭院应该是不成问题了。
Having a salt certificate meant you had permission to buy and sell salt issued by the authorities of the Ming and Qing dynasties. Since Yongzhou was located at the convergence of the Yangtze River, Huaihua River, and Great Canal, it was the perfect place for a trading hub, and all the salt produced in the area could be conveniently transferred to cities around the country through its adjacent waterways. Not only was Yongzhou the administrative center for salt production, it also had the largest transfer station in China at the time. Every single merchant wanted a piece of the pie, and they would go to almost any length to acquire a salt certificate. It was the equivalent to the California gold rush in the mid-1800s.
朝廷给盐商制定了一个非常优惠的政策，任何天下的商人，只要按照朝廷的规定交纳一定的金钱，然后就可以到扬州来做一个世袭的盐商。
After settling in Yongzhou, a merchant's first order of business was to establish close ties with the local officials. As extensions of the imperial court, salt merchants effectively monopolized the selling and circulation of salt, often manipulating prices so they could earn enormous profits in the process. This young woman from Yongzhou is Mao Jian. In just a few hours, she'll be getting married. The ceremony will be a group wedding, which will take place in Guya Garden. The function is modeled after the traditional weddings held by salt merchants 100 years ago. The brides and grooms all don the customary garb from the period. Extravagant gardens like this one are one of Yongzhou's many cultural highlights. Guya Garden is the largest garden of its kind in Yongzhou and is just as impressive as it was in its time. Its natural beauty and meticulous layout are a symbol of the elegant lifestyles ancient salt merchants led. As one walks amongst its reflective ponds, flagstone pathways, and perfectly pruned trees, it's hard not to be overwhelmed by its majesty. For Mao Jian and her soon-to-be husband, it's like getting married in heaven itself. In the Ming and Qing dynasties, many of the most lavish homes were owned by salt merchants, each one having its own distinct style and layout. But perhaps the most famous garden from this golden age was Kongshan Garden, the residence of the wealthy merchant Jiang Chuan. While only 30 years old at the time, Jiang Chuan was already one of the 8 wealthiest merchants in Yongzhou. In 1751, he and several other rich salt merchants gathered at his residence for an important reception. They were waiting for the arrival of Emperor Qianlong. He had already heard of Yongzhou's unparalleled beauty, but more than anything, he wanted to visit the city that had made his empire so prosperous over the years. It would mark the first time the then 40-year-old emperor had left the capital to inspect the southern regions of the Yangtze River.
明朝和清朝一样啊，国库里面，如果它是一个烧饼，它有一半啊是来自盐业的，在盐业的这个一半里面啊，又有一半啊是来自扬州，就是扬州盐商所贡献的税金，占了明清两个朝廷国库收入的1/4，这是一个非常了不得的一个数字。所以皇帝他重视这个地方，并不是对扬州盐商本身有什么兴趣，说是对他的政权特别重视，政权的周转的资金有1/4是依靠这个地方的商人，他当然要跟这个地方的商人要搞好关系。
Jiang Chuan took special care in every aspect of the grand reception, even going as far as to inquire about the emperor's specific culinary and musical tastes. If there was ever a time to impress someone, this was certainly it. Back then, it was common for the salt merchants of Yangzhou to keep opera troupes on hand for special occasions. As it happened, Jiang Chuan had two, De Yin and Chuan Tai, who together could perform over 1,000 plays.
春台班唱的是地方戏，这个德音班唱的是昆山腔，这两个戏班啊是一雅一俗。这皇帝来了以后，他喜欢雅的，我就给他唱这个德音班唱戏；唱俗的呢，就让春台班唱戏。所以他是一个非常精明的一个商人。
It said the emperor was so satisfied with the performance that he was still enchanted by the beautiful music long after returning to the capital. On his 80th birthday, he called in 4 opera troupes from Anhui to perform for him, which eventually gave birth to the Peking Opera. Moved by Jiang Chuan's forethought and consideration, the two men formed the rarest of friendships, one an emperor, the other a common businessman. Of course, along with it came some tangible benefits for Jiang Chuan. Qianlong made 6 more trips to the area, costing Jiang Chuan and other salt merchants around 11.2 million taels of silver. The emperor repaid Jiang by awarding him the position of a highly ranked official, making him one of the wealthiest salt merchants in China's history. Cheshire Lake is one of Yangzhou's most famous tourist sites. It's said that when Qianlong first visited the lake, he told Jiang Chuan a white tower should be erected there. So to please the emperor, Jiang Chuan had it built overnight. Whether the story is true or not, there are plenty of records describing a sort of honeymoon period between the emperor and the salt merchants. However, later the emperor was made aware that the salt merchants he so favored had been secretly stealing from him. Late one evening, the administrator of salt affairs for the city received a message from the capital. But instead of containing words, the envelope was filled with tea and salt. At that moment, the official knew something was amiss. Several months before, the emperor had received an anonymous report which alleged that in the last 22 years, Jiang Chuan and his men had evaded as much as 10 million taels of silver in taxes. Since the Chinese word for tea is pronounced similar to the word for investigate, the contents of the envelope literally meant investigate salt. That July, salt merchants turned from trusted friends to suspects. Jiang Chuan had no choice but to race to the capital and beg for his emperor's mercy. Kneeling before Qianlong, Jiang Chuan confessed his own crimes, as well as over 100,000 taels of silver him and his men took in bribes. In the end, Qianlong showed mercy, depriving him of his official position, but allowing the merchants to continue to trade in salt. Still, the corruption scandal dealt a heavy blow to the Yongzhou salt merchants, and it took the men 11 years to pay back all the money they owed. After that, Jiang Chuan never returned to his former glory. With the erosion of trust, salt profits were under even greater scrutiny. From that point on, every merchant knew that while the business was indeed lucrative, there was always the chance their wealth could be stripped from them in a moment's notice. In his wisdom, Qianlong knew that killing the merchants would serve no purpose. After all, he needed them to pay back the taxes they had evaded and continue bringing wealth to the empire. In the Ming and Qing dynasties, tea, salt, silk, and water transportation were integral to the health of the national economy. As one of the world's most basic and inexhaustible natural resources, salt has been nurturing life on this planet from the earliest stages of our existence. And it will continue to do so for lifetimes to come.